I'm Amit Pal, Communications Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show.
I'm Liz Cavell, a constitutional attorney here at FFRF.
And I'm Ryan Jane, also an attorney here at FFRF. We'd like you to join in here with us. If you have a question or a comment for us, just comment here on Facebook or via email at askanatheist.org.
An item has made the national news. Earlier this month, an 11-year-old student at Lawton Childs Middle Academy in Lakeland, Florida, was actually arrested after a confrontation with a teacher after he refused to stand during the Pledge of Allegiance. According to news reports, a substitute teacher told the student to stand for the pledge, and when he refused, she asked why, if it is so bad here, he did not go to another place to live. She called the office, and apparently a confrontation ensued, and the resource officer was involved. Lakeland Police Department, whose school resource officer made the decision to arrest, also put out a press release insisting that the arrest was, and this here, let me remind people, it was an 11-year-old. The arrest was for resisting an officer without violence and disrupting a school function.
And so Polk County Public Schools is the school district where this happened, and they put out a statement too on Monday, the 18th, to stress that, one, the school was not responsible for the decision to arrest, and two, that the student was not arrested for refusing to participate in the pledge. The school district, to their credit, also denounced the actions of the teacher. They said, quote, "We do not condone the substitute's behavior. We respect our students' right to freedom of expression, and we are committed to protecting that critical right while ensuring peaceful classrooms so all students can learn."
So we do want to be clear that the story is still developing in the media, and many of the allegations are disputed by the mother of the child. But we know this whole situation did arise out of a student's decision to abstain from saying the Pledge of Allegiance and a teacher's ignorance of the student's rights. What is the law when it comes to students saying the Pledge of Allegiance in school? Ryan, could you enlighten us about that?
Yeah, so fortunately, this is a relatively clear portion of First Amendment jurisprudence. There are some areas that are more convoluted. This particular one is really simple. There's a Supreme Court case called Barnett that directly addressed the issue of students sitting for the pledge, and they said that students have a right to sit for the pledge. Public schools cannot force kids to participate or stand for the pledge as long as they are not disrupting the class and they're just choosing not to participate. They can't be punished or retaliated against in any way for that. So that's the rule, full stop. And it's one of the easier cases to understand what exactly is going on.
And Liz, can you give us sort of a Cliff Notes version of just a tiny sort of synopsis of the pledge's history, how it was amended later on, and why?
Yeah.
Is it that FFRF has an issue with the pledge the way it is?
Right. So I think most people know that the Pledge of Allegiance, as we know it today, was not the original Pledge of Allegiance that was written. And I think it dates back to around 1892, the 1890s, when the original pledge, which is thrown up there on the screen, and it's basically like the modern pledge, except for the words "under God" do not appear in the original pledge. It just says "one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." The "under God" language was, of course, infamously added in the 1950s. I think it was 54. Basically in response to Cold War communist paranoia.
Absolutely, this was the era of Joe McCarthy, unfortunately, from our very own state.
Yes.
And it was around the same time that "In God We Trust" sort of motto was also adopted, around the same time, 50s, exactly the height of the Red Scare.
Right, exactly. And it was sort of a very nationalistic, anti-communist response, political response to the hysteria around the Cold War and the Red Scare. So the pledge became more sort of religionized. It became both more of a religious type of loyalty oath, and of course it's become this sort of point of indoctrination in its daily recitation in public school morning exercises or daily exercises.
And if I may sort of recount a personal anecdote, a family anecdote, and at one level it's frivolous, but it also shows how kids take so seriously what's told to them. Both my girls, when my younger one was in kindergarten and the older one in 3rd grade in an elementary school here in Madison, the pledge used to be recited over the loudspeaker, and at the end the principal used to add, "It's a great day for learning." And they thought that was part of the pledge. And I had to sort of, disabuse them of that notion and tell them, girls, not really. So, but that shows exactly how seriously kids at that age take what's told to them, and they don't question it. Exactly. And thankfully, the pledge is not recited here in Madison in middle schools or in high schools. Now my girls are older. But
it's not?
No, it's at least in the ones they've gone to. So that's good, yeah. The middle school they've gone to, and now my older one is in high school, and at that high school also it isn't.
Although the elementary school strikes me as far and away the most problematic. When
Sure,
you have,
certainly.
Kids who are 6 to 12 years old. These are the kids who are internalizing the message in this very rote manner, where it's just they're just being forced to recite this thing every day at a high school level. They at least understand what's going on with the ritual. I actually have a recent situation that I've been handling here at FFRF where we had a school district that I won't name because we're still hammering out the details of it, but there is a kindergartner who chose not to participate in the pledge. And the way that this school handles things is every morning they get the entire school together in the gymnasium, and they have morning announcements basically, and all say the pledge. And there's this one kindergartner who every day says, I just choose to quietly sit and not participate in the pledge. And the principal has asserted that his not participating shows disrespect to her personally. So it's not even the usual patriotic line, or what we heard in the Polk County thing where it's like, why don't you move to another country? The principal was personally affronted by this and said, you owe it to me to participate in this pledge when I lead it. And they actually physically remove this 6-year-old and send him to the principal's office every day when he does this. So this again is just, it's an incredible thing that this has been settled law for so long. Since World War II, this has been settled, but there are still school districts that are requiring kids to participate in the pledge. And to go back to the Polk County one, in there at least, the school district handled it at least partially the right way, where after the fact they admitted the substitute teacher was wrong. They said they won't be teaching here again, and handled it that way at least.
So could you both, in the couple of years I've been here at FFRF, I've seen that this is a recurrent kind of, instance. These instances keep on coming to us ever so often, and involving sort of variations on these two situations that we've spoken about. Could you talk about sort of some of the stuff that we have received regarding the Pledge of Allegiance and how we usually respond to that?
Right, yeah. So, back to sort of the under God piece and the adding under God to the pledge, I think, is a sort of a particular affront to our state church separation mission and values. And so, of course, we take issue and we try to educate on the religiosity of the pledge, that really and truly, even though courts have accepted it as sort of an accepted ceremonial part of our national patriotism, within God we trust and with the pledge, we do view it as inconsistent with the Establishment Clause, because certainly reciting every day that we're one nation under God, there's really no way to view that as a non-religious profession. And if it's being mandated or if it's being recognized as the official pledge or the official motto of the United States, we think that that's a problem. But for that reason and for other reasons, FFRF hears every year from students in public schools who, like the student in Polk County, are being wrongly confronted, rebuked, or flat out disciplined for their decision to sit down and quietly abstain from saluting the flag or saying the pledge. And we probably get, a dozen or 24 of these types of complaints every single year.
Yeah.
And we always have. Of course, there's been a real uptick in the last couple of years around this type of symbolic protest due to the NFL, the very high profile.
Absolutely, yes.
And just widely fanned flames by our president and others in the sort of national discourse about sitting down during the Pledge of Allegiance or during the national anthem, and young people sort of emulating that as a method of protesting things that they're not happy with about our country and its national promise. So I would say in the past couple of years, we're probably hearing a little bit more about conflict between school teachers and administrators and students who want to protest in that way, peacefully protest by not taking a loyalty oath every morning and reciting the pledge, sometimes for reasons like racial injustice, as we see in the NFL, but
Sure.
oftentimes with our members and their children, they don't feel like the pledge reflects their beliefs because it really is a religious oath as well.
Yeah, well, and to underscore how much many people see it as a religious oath, whenever we are doing state church separation work in other areas, it's always a go-to argument right off the bat.
Yes.
They say, well, don't you know this is one nation under God?
Yes.
So therefore, of course, we can pray at our meetings,
Yeah.
and of course, we can lead Bible studies and all these things, So
Yeah.
to them, it's like a camel's nose in the tent almost, where they're like, once we got under God in the pledge, this is kind of codifying the religious nature of the country to their mind. And never mind that that's a complete 180 from the game they have to play in court whenever anything related to this gets challenged. They have to say, no, this is purely patriotic and it's ceremonial deism. Nobody actually thinks this is invoking a religious message, which of course that's nonsense. So This kind of game is why we just keep hearing about this over and over again. And I think it's really interesting that the original pledge didn't have the under God language. So that is a recent addition to kind of inject religion into the pledge. But there is a religious liberty component to the history of the pledge cases, because the case that we were talking about before, Barnett, it's a West Virginia public school case involving two sisters named Barnett. That was actually, so the Barnett sisters were Jehovah's Witnesses, and this was actually a do-over of an earlier case. And there's a picture of the Barnett sisters then and more recently. And so they were Jehovah's Witnesses who objected to the pledge because they thought that it actually violated the second commandment of having the first amendment, first commandment of having another God, basically, right? You're pledging to something in addition to the God that they believe in. So they saw that as problematic. So it was for their religious reasons that they didn't want to participate in the pledge. And that was the same thing that happened in this earlier case called Gobitis. And the Supreme Court actually, in an 8-1 decision, told Gobitis, sorry, you lose. You don't have a right to be out, to not participate in the pledge. If the state wants to mandate your kids participate in the pledge, they can do it. And this was done in a time, we talk about later with the Red Scare happening. This was during, this was in 1939, I believe. So this was lead up to World War II. Everyone was really freaked out about what was going on in Europe. And so the idea of forced patriotism didn't sound so crazy, that, we need to stay unified because there's this threat of fascism coming from Europe. And it's kind of hilarious when you look at what was going on at the time, because now when we look back, anyone who's watching who's familiar with the Bellamy salute that kids used to do when they said the pledge, there's a picture of it, and looking at it with today's eyes, you'd say, holy cow, the irony of this being an anti-Nazi ritual is pretty obvious.
I was just, when you were saying, Ryan, about how the country was feeling under threat from fascism, but of course, central tenet of fascism is forced patriotism.
Exactly.
So that's ironic,
right,
too.
so the irony is thick, And so, but at the time, the Supreme Court thought that this made sense, and the only dissenting justice was Harlan Stone, who then actually became the Chief Justice when the Barnett case came up. And he had convinced several of the justices who ruled against the Gabaitis kids to flip their vote on basically identical facts, the Jehovah's Witnesses objecting to the pledge, and asked a new justice, fresh on the bench, Robert Jackson, to write the opinion. And so for a new, basically freshman justice, this is actually one of the most beautiful opinions that's ever been written. And so you can see this is one of the most famous quotes from the case. So it's, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by words or act their faith therein. That's one of the most famous quotes from any Supreme Court.
For the ages, and one that we actually cite ever so often.
Yeah, it's a great quote. And actually the entire opinion is great. So normally I don't recommend non-lawyers spend their time reading Supreme Court opinions, but Barnett's actually a good one. You should definitely read it. And so again, that was a freshman justice who wrote that at the direction of Harlan Stone, who was the sole dissenter in the prior decision. So it's a really interesting case. And the Jehovah's Witnesses wanted this to actually be a case decided on religious liberty. They wanted this to be a free exercise case, which is another part of the First Amendment, of course. But the Supreme Court actually treated it as a free expression case. So now we cite Barnett for general propositions about the First Amendment like that, but it's also more seen as a symbolic speech and free expression case, not so much a religious liberty case.
It really was decided on this really broad idea of the First Amendment, that is freedom of thought, just freedom of thought, freedom of dissent, freedom of expression, and these freedoms that we have that are embodied in the entirety of the First Amendment, that really just make up a foundational American value. And that is obviously the thing that separates us from fascist governments, is that we have the right to have unorthodox opinions, have unpopular opinions, dissent and protest peacefully our government, and the things that are orthodox and the things that are majoritarian. And so Barnett is definitely a case for all the First Amendment nerds, but it's definitely one that we still cite as really important law on what the First Amendment as a whole really means the government can and can't do, both on the forced speech side, but also the Establishment Clause side, and saying what shall be orthodox in religion and politics, and in nationalism. And to answer Amit's question from earlier about how FFRF responds to these student complaints, really it usually comes in the form of, not to the level of what happened in Polk County, Florida, but it usually involves a similar kind of confrontation.
Yeah, I've noticed that too.
Between a dissenting student and a teacher who is ignorant of the student's rights, challenging the student, resulting in some sort of confrontation or sometimes discipline of the student. And then either the student or the parent reaches out to us saying, my kid's being told if they don't stand, they're going to get a detention, or, they're being called out every day. Is this right? What are they allowed to do? And we usually contact school districts right away to make sure that they're educating their teachers on what the law is, because this is one of those situations where if a teacher is calling out a student, embarrassing them, disciplining them, or flat out forcing them to stand for the pledge, or saying something like, you don't have to say it, but you do have to stand and salute, which we get a lot of. That's simply not the law, because, teachers are government actors, and they can't force students, even in public school classrooms, to salute or show reverence to the pledge exercises.
Yeah, and usually I think school districts are pretty good. This is one of these areas that we don't usually get much pushback, where we just show them the law, and the administrators of the school or the school attorney will look at it and say, okay, FFRF is obviously correct about this. So we usually get immediate compliance when we bring one of these issues to school's attention, although there are notable exceptions, like the case I mentioned earlier that we're working on right now. And I remember a couple years ago in Texas, there was a...
Is that the one from 2017?
Yes, I believe so.
Sure.
And so I believe there was a girl who got expelled. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I think this was Cypress Fair Independent School District, Texas,
Sure.
where a student in high school was expelled from the district for not so up on what the nitty-gritty of the facts were, but arising out of her refusal to stand for the
Wow.
pledge. She actually sued the school district, and of course the Texas Attorney General intervened in defense of the school district's expulsion of her, of course, and with lots of great pronouncements on behalf of the state of Texas regarding forced piety and forced nationalism. So cool.
Yeah,
but
and to make it clear, again, that like not participating in the pledge is not an anti-patriotic act. I think that's something that just needs to get hammered home. That and the same thing for kneeling for the pledge. It's kneeling for the national anthem. That you are not sending a message that you hate America or anything like that.
Right. I mean, it's just there's just this ultimate irony, and if you've argued with anyone online about this topic,
Not recommended.
Yeah, not recommended. You know that it's hard not to circle around just these different views of what the values are that are embodied by the flag and even the words in the pledge, and that the whole concept in Barnett and the freedom to dissent and the freedom to not be forced to profess anything with which you don't agree. Those are fundamental American ideals, and those are the kind of genius principles of our
Sure.
country and our founding. But yet, nothing gets people more whipped up than someone who will not just profess against their own will and despite their objections, loyalty and fealty to a flag or, an idea. So I think there's a lot of just sort of passion and emotion around the issue. And I think that's where we see a lot of confrontation between individual teachers or substitute teachers or administrators who have their own personal feelings about the pledge and about nationalism, and who are not educated on the law and what students' rights are around this issue, and they take that into the classroom. Sure. And so it sounds like that's exactly what happened in this Florida middle school, and so oftentimes it's just a matter of reminding school districts to educate their teachers around this issue. There's definitely a lot of miseducation, especially because of the NFL controversies.
Yes.
And the NFL's shameful response to these controversies. But whatever you may think about that and whatever your opinion is on what NFL players should or shouldn't be forced to do, the NFL is a private entity.
Yeah.
Public school
I'm glad you
districts
pointed that out. That's
government
a
actors.
major distinction.
Yeah.
Right. For better or worse, the NFL is a private employer. I suppose they can make their people, their players, do what they want, and they've got carrots and sticks, and they're operating in the private world. Yeah. Public school teachers are government actors. Yeah. They can't use the power of their government office to force students or anyone else to engage in speech or expression that they want to dissent from.
Yeah, and I think when you're trying to educate either teachers who are doing this or anyone who you're talking to who is in that mindset of no, nationalism and patriotism is more important than the right to dissent or whatever. The education that has to take place there is the same growth that happened in the Supreme Court from the 39 Gabaitis case to Barnett, right? So you could point to them to that or read it yourself as a way to talk about it, and you can kind of get in the minds of when you're in this spot in 1939 where everything's really scary, and you say, no, we don't think it's okay for you to dissent. We need everybody to be on the same team here. And then there's something I didn't mention before is there was tremendous violence against Jehovah's Witnesses after that, thousands of instances of people being attacked. So it was this terrible the circumstance that happened. And then we entered World War II, and the members of the Supreme Court looked at that decision and realized basically the irony of it, I think, that this is so fundamentally wrong. Yeah. The country that we're supposed to be pledging allegiance to stands on the proposition that we have the freedom to express ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's incoherent to say that we're going to be standing up for this country by forcing a patriotic ritual.
Yeah.
That just makes no sense. And so I think people can get there, but you have to kind of walk them through it.
Right. And I do think a lot of this sometimes comes down to, in the complaints that we get, it can be unique because it's a very personal interaction and confrontation between an individual student and a school district
So they feel their authority challenged, yeah.
Right. And so when we are trying to resolve these, it's either a very simple response from the district that is like, okay, we've educated our teacher, we've educated our staff, or it's a lot of he said, she said grumbling around what actually went down, how disruptive was the student. You know, Polk County, or well, I should say Lakeland Police Department is, you know, now put in the position of defending why they arrested an 11-year-old kid. You know, was he resisting arrest without violence?
And
or
if
whatever
so, what
that
was he
is.
resisting arrest
You know,
for?
being disruptive, making threats, and you know, it's no, that didn't happen. Yes, that did happen. Kind of factual disputes, which are unlike a lot of the things that are reported to us, which is usually.
I can see that having two girls in the public school system. I can see that. Yeah,
of course.
It would come down to that. Yeah.
So they can be challenging complaints to pursue in that way.
Certainly.
But the law should be very clear, and frankly, I think public school officials should be better educated around student rights on, especially this issue that has just exploded, and that there's confusion on because of the NFL's role and how it differs from a public school district's role, and so yeah, there's no shortage of people reporting these types of problems to us, and it's kind of
especially when you get
shame.
things like the governor of Texas weighing in defense of a school district who is forcing kids to say the pledge. Of course, you're going to get teachers who get on that bandwagon and want
that's,
to.
of course, Governor Abbott. In that
Abbott or
case,
Paxton?
It might have still been Paxton. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay.
2 years ago.
Okay, 2 years ago. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Certainly. So, talking of public opinion, do you both have anything to add as to the primer, to the background, or should we go to public opinion and see what folks have to ask of us, and then try to answer those questions?
Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
ready for
I mean,
questions.
I think without getting too nerdy on the history and the legal history, I mean, I think we think it's really important that people are educated around the history of the pledge, the fact that the religious parts of the pledge are not, the pledge itself is not a foundational American
I think it's important to point
idea.
that.
Pledging loyalty to the government is something I think would have been anathema to a lot of our founders. But that, you know, we've seen this nationalistic fervor really swell in times that are not particularly proud times in American history, times where people were absolutely afraid, frantic, hysterical. I mean, I think post 9/11 was another time when a lot of mandatory pledge exercises, and I think here in Madison, if I'm remembering my FFRF history correctly, there was a lot of public outcry and also just turmoil when, after 9/11, the Madison School District was grappling with whether or not to sort of adopt daily pledge exercises because that was seen as something that was important in that moment in time when everyone was just horrified and terrified.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So anyway, that's kind of our big history lesson on the pledge whenever this topic comes up, that I think it's important to note. And that, yes, the pledge stands for values and American ideas, and the American promise. And I think it's cool that young people understand that, you know, they can protest and that they can make a statement about what they're not happy about with the American promise by
and remarkably in this instance, a kindergartner, a 5-year-old.
Right, I know. So yeah, I think that's.
Oh, and the other point that I always try to squeeze into a discussion about the pledge, as a grammar nerd, in addition to being a constitutional nerd, it bothers me to no end that the phrase "one nation indivisible" was divided by the insertion of the phrase one, under God. So
Yeah,
now
no,
one
you're right.
nation under God,
Yeah.
indivisible. It's just now this stumbling, unconnected phrase where it's
Yeah.
supposed to be one nation, indivisible. So the irony is just very thick with, with
Right.
this issue.
Of course, and it injects religion right there, which doesn't get more divisive than religion.
Yeah.
So
So
anyway,
let's-
we
yeah.
definitely can take
Certainly.
questions if we're there.
Certainly.
And again, if you have questions, you can just put comment on Facebook Live, then we'll see them.
Yeah. So Vanessa Gonzalez asks, if under God was removed from the pledge, this is a good question actually. Do you think then would it be mandatory to show support for, as she says, your country and the founding fathers?
Well, I think the answer to constitutionally, could it be mandatory, is no, unequivocally. It's Barnett doesn't rest in any way on the fact that under God is part of the pledge.
It was before it was put in the pledge, so it
Was it 50?
Yeah, Barnett
I was
was in
going to ask,
40,
yeah.
43.
Oh, 43.
So,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
So
that's-
Barnett
yeah.
was decided.
I'm glad you
at a
pointed
time
that out
before
because even
that.
I was unclear on the
Right.
on the timeline.
Yeah, so the law question is definitely a no.
Right. I mean, the constitutional principle that the government can't force people to engage in a loyalty oath or, you know, salute the flag or make a pledge is broader than, you know, it's not related to whether or not the pledge is religious. It has to do with the freedom to dissent and the freedom to express yourself, you know, the freedom to not be compelled to express, you know, anything related to nationalism, politics, any idea with which you disagree. So no, and then maybe maybe that question might be also asking sort of, are you
exactly. Yeah.
are you
So,
opposed
yeah,
to
yeah,
daily
yeah.
recitation
You
of the
as in
pledge
us as
in
individuals,
public
yeah,
school?
yeah.
And I don't know if FFRF has a position on that. Although I think a lot of our members really think about the First Amendment in a way that you know, daily loyalty oaths are kind of gross to us. I feel that way. I think loyalty oaths for young public school kids is not a cool way to do representative democracy.
Yeah,
so that's just my personal opinion, and that wouldn't really be changed if under God were removed from the pledge. But I would like it a lot.
Yeah, and a lot of people object to the last part of the pledge as well, where it's you know, liberty and justice for all. If you feel like the country is not meeting that standard, opting out of the pledge has become a very common symbolic way to express that dissent. And so
Right, certainly.
that makes a great deal of sense, and you're certainly still going to see that. And I would fully support people who are doing that, even if under God we're not in the pledge. But with that said, I would say if your goal is to try to increase patriotism by getting more people to participate in the pledge voluntarily, removing under God is a great first step. You're going to get a lot of people who only really object to that part of it. And if they were told, you know, we're going to recite every day the pledge as it was originally written, you're going to get a big uptick in the number of people who actually are willing to participate because you lose the religious objection.
The religious aspect of it, yeah. This from Tristan Howell. Great question. A few, if I may say so, rhetorical points initially, which are in broad alignment with our way of thinking, but then an actual question at the end. So he says, I've never understood why the Pledge of Allegiance needs to be said daily. Do school administrators seriously think children are likely to turn traitor overnight if they don't say it? It also, and this is a good point, stigmatizes disabled students who can't physically stand for the pledge. That's a good point too.
Yeah.
And at the end, a very good question, which actually I as a layperson also have. My question for you is, can private schools force students to say the pledge?
I suppose they can.
Yeah, certainly the First Amendment is not going to come to your rescue. So
Yeah.
I think that if the private schools, broadly speaking, have very broad powers to make their own rules, they can kick you out or punish you for practically anything. So,
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, isn't that an irony that basic constitutional protections, I've always found that so ironic, most often do not extend to the private realm in so many ways. I mean, and just, a bit off topic, even the Civil Rights Act, etc., a lot of businesses in the South argued that, hey, we are private. Hence, all of that doesn't apply to us.
Right.
So exactly. So that's kind of interesting that you confirmed that for private schools.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a, an exercise of the libertarian dream scenario where they're just kind of saying, well, if you don't like this exercise your kids are being put through, then pull your kid out of that school and go to a different school that you like better. And if enough kids do that, the school's going to be incentivized to change their practice. But that's not the way that the government works. We'll just say that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, those are the couple of questions we had, and it's we had a great discussion. It's time to end the show now, and so that's all for the show today, folks. And as always, if you want to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone, text FFRF to 52886, and data rates may apply. And again, that's FFRF to 52886. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next week again for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. And thank you so much, Liz and Ryan, for joining us and for that really educational, informative sort of, discourse and talk that we had on the pledge. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure.
Bye-bye.